Hi, this is Brian Veda, owner of CrossFit Incendia. Chris likes to get you dialed in on your finances, and I like to get him dialed in on fitness. But first, check this out.
Money has a link to happiness, and spending money, there are things that make people happy. You should embrace that. It's not about just cutting every expense all the time and maximizing. I mean, we're not trying to live through a survival budget throughout our life all the time. There's a balance that's needed between enjoying life, going out and doing things and hitting our goals.
Excited for today's guest, Jeff Whelpley, coming on the show today. He is a cash flow / budgeting expert. When I say budgeting expert, you know me. I love talking about budgeting. I love talking about having a plan for your money, and he takes it to the next level. In the show, we're going to break down the top 4 ways people are budgeting. There's 4 main ways if you break it down. We're going to talk about each one of those ways, when they work, when they don't work. So a couple of these things you're not going to want to use right now. Some of them you are. And then we're going to talk about how he's helping people create a better cash flow system, a better budget for their money. So without further ado, let me bring on Jeff Whelpley from Swish. Hey, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the Money Peach podcast. Excited to have you on.
Thanks, Chris. I'm super excited as well.
So Jeff is for those of you who don't know Jeff, he is I'm going to call him the budgeting expert. So as you can imagine, I nerd out all the time thinking about how you guys can go out and save more money by simply just creating a plan or a budget. But some of you guys don't like calling it a budget, so we'll just call it a plan for your money. And through a friend of a friend of a friend, I came across this guy, Jeff, who's on the show today, he speaks our language. He is an expert in everything budgeting. And so I like to think of myself as a budgeting expert, but then when I talk to Jeff, I'm like, we are at the same level. If not, I'm looking up to him for even more advice because he has this thing nailed down. So Jeff, we're going to be diving into the world of budgeting.
That is my field of expertise, and I love talking about budgeting. So let's get to it.
Okay, so before we go any further, budgeting is not boring. And I think when people first listen to it, they think it's so restrictive. They think it's like prison, it's bread and water. I'm going to have to tell my wife that she can't go shopping at Target anymore. Or I'm going to have to tell my husband that he can't watch the NFL Sunday ticket because it's not in the budget, or can't go to Home Depot, or whatever it might be. When you hear these questions, because you and I have talked about this, what are some of the things that pop up in your mind when somebody tells you like, Jeff, oh man, you're in the budgeting business? That's the worst business ever. It's boring.
It's true. I mean, it's not a fun thing to talk about restricting stuff that you do. And that's essentially what one aspect or one way you can view budgeting is, that it's restricting your spending. It's preventing you from doing the things that you want to do. And that's never fun. But I would kind of pose it back to you that there's a different way to look at this. Why are you budgeting, or why do you want to budget in the first place? And people do it for different reasons. There's not one reason, but typically it's because people are trying to achieve something. They're trying to achieve a goal, trying to get, whether it's retirement savings, or they want to buy a new house, get out of debt, which is a big one, obviously. There's something they're trying to achieve. So you can sort of flip this on its head and think about it a different way. You want to achieve these different goals. How are you going to achieve those? How are you going to get to the things that you want? And budgeting is the way in which you do that. So yes, you do have to restrict some stuff, but you're doing that to an end. There's an end result that you're trying to achieve. And I think when you align those two things, then it can be a more positive and fun experience.
I love what you said there. It's not, the budgeting isn't actually the thing. It's the goal that you have in mind. So for example, if you're somebody that's like, you know what, I want to lose weight. Losing weight's the goal. The gym, or your nutrition coach, or whoever, that is the tool that you're going to use. Or if you're thinking, I want to generate more income on the weekends, right? So generating income would be the end goal. The tool is going to be, what are you going to do? The tool, no one gets upset about the tool, right? The tool is the tool. And that's what I tell people with, like you just said, with budgeting. It's not like the goal is to get on a budget, right? No, the goal is to pay off debt, or the goal is to have a down payment for a house, or the goal is to save up for a vacation. And what is the best tool to do that? The tool is the budget. For those of you that don't like the word budget, my wife doesn't allow me to use the word budget. We call it a cash flow plan or a cash flow formula. But you will hear me say budgeting a lot on this because that's the language Jeff and I speak. So just want to throw that out there because I know a lot of you who listen to the show know that I'm not a big fan of the word budget. But yeah, I love what you said there. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think your own history, Chris. I mean, I've listened to a lot of your podcasts and materials. I think you prove this statement, right? Like you have a major success story in your past. When you were in debt, you got out of it, and now you're kind of financially free to some degree. And that is awesome. And when you achieve your goals, it feels so great. So like the key to budgeting is focusing on that end, focusing on what you're trying to achieve. And then if you do that, it all becomes about mechanics, about the nitty-gritty details of how you get there.
Absolutely. And the mechanics, that's the part that's why I wanted you to have a call on the show. You see, so we on our site, we have a budgeting tutorial or cash flow formula tutorial. We take people through and just basically show them the very basics. And as you can imagine, in this niche for the last couple of years, the Money Peach audience, we get hit up a ton with different types of budgeting techniques. I've had people on the show that told me that budgets are the worst thing ever. And I bring them on the show because I like that conversation, right? We had a guest a while back that said she doesn't think anybody should do a budget. You only live once and you should spend within reason, but you only live once. And I was like, I'm going to disagree there. But the mechanics of budgeting, I think they're good natured, but I think they've become overcomplicated. And you and I think we both agree with that.
Oh, completely. I think that it's very easy to get too scientific, to overthink how you're going to do things. And if you look around, there's different types of techniques and different ways of doing budgeting that appeal to different people. But at a kind of overall level, what I'm seeing a lot of is the kind of different techniques that are being pushed. A lot of them are too much. And what happens as a result is that people try things out and then they don't stick with it. That's like a very, very common thing that happens for people. Even if they try something to do budgeting, then they don't stick with it. And a large part of that is because it's overly complicated. It requires you to do too much. It doesn't actually, you don't see that kind of quick feedback loop of how the things involved with the budgeting result in those goals.
Absolutely. I'm going to go back to the whole weight loss thing because I think everybody can relate to the weight loss or getting healthy. And it doesn't have as much of a bad stereotype as you hear with like, oh, budgeting, it's prison. No one says, oh man, when I want to lose weight and look better, it's like prison water, right? No one says that. But you have 10,000 different diets out there, and some of them, are very, very simple, right? Eat rice only. That's it. And then some of them are really complicated. Like you're going to measure every protein, every fat, every carbohydrate. And I think there's a lot of success with either way you want to go, but I don't think there's a one size fits all strategy, except when you come across some things, which I'm a big fan of the Money Peach cash flow formula, but there are some other things where I'm like, this actually works for a broad audience. And so before we jump into what's working, there are basically, let's just break them down. There are 4 basic budgeting techniques that you see out there. And there's hundreds and hundreds of different apps attached to these 4, I would say, if you just want to categorize them. So let's go over these first 4, Jeff. The first one that I think we hear a lot of is the envelope system, I think made famous by probably Dave Ramsey. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so Dave's a big fan. There's a lot of them out there. This is probably maybe the number one most popular, or at least traditionally what has been pushed a lot. And it's something where the idea is that you're doing zero-based budgeting. You are upfront identifying categories of spending, and you're allocating money from your budget into each of those areas upfront. Now, with the cash envelope system, it goes a little bit beyond just like theoretically coming up with these categories, that if you kind of follow it strictly, you actually have physical cash that you're putting in physical envelopes and then using those. Now, depending on who you are, that is actually either a really good thing or a bad thing. On the good side, there are people that are heavily motivated by using physical cash. There is like studies that when you actually have to physically fork over cash instead of using your credit card, you're more willing to kind of restrict your spending because it's just a harder like mental barrier to get over. However, there's a lot of downsides on the other side, including you can lose your cash, which happens a lot. It's like a common thing that people who try this out, that they lose the envelope somewhere. I mean, you lose your keys, you lose your envelope, and then it screws everything up. It's also hard to know exactly where you are at overall, like, because if you have your money split on like between a dozen different envelopes, physical envelopes, and you want to know, okay, generally where you're at for the month, you sort of have to open each envelope and count the money. And it's enough of a barrier that you don't really know where you're at throughout the month, but it can be effective for some people for sure.
So I'm a big fan of the cash envelope system. Now, We currently use it just in 3 categories of our life, Jeff, but what we teach, and the reason why we're a big fan of it, is a lot of the people that come to our site, they're overdrafted, they're paycheck to paycheck, and they're just looking for something to get started with. I don't think envelopes are going to be for everyone. However, one of the things that we've learned, and there's been scientific research on this, I'm sure you're aware of this as well, but Carnegie Mellon did a study where they actually put you under an MRI scan, and they watched brain activity as you paid with cash versus paying with a debit or a credit card, basically cash for plastic. And kind of a side note, this study was paid for by banks. Now, think of that in your mind. Why would they want to know this? Okay, that should be light bulb number 1. So when you're paying with cash, your brain, the same receptors that feel pain, those receptors are activated in your brain, according to this study. So that means when you pay with cash, you feel it. It's like, ooh. And I use this example all the time. Let's just say that you go to the grocery store and you have a cart full of groceries, your kid's screaming, there's a line of people behind you, and you just want to get to the car and load this up and get home. Now, you swipe your card and you get out of there and you're like, I think I spent, I'm not quite sure. I'll find out at the end of the month, or I'll go online today and find out, or I'll go on an app or whatever. But with cash, when she says it's $172 and you take 2 $100 bills out and you hand them over, I don't care who you are. You're a thousandaire, a millionaire, or a billionaire. You feel that at some point. You feel that money leaving you right there. And so that's why I'm a big fan of cash. Now, I don't think people should be using cash for everything for the rest of their lives, but I just like the idea of them feeling that, oh, this is how this works. Like money is actually gone. It's gone. It's gone. It's not coming back. That is kind of our cash envelope. That's our why behind it. So Jeff, the next question I have for you, the number 2 type of budgeting that we talked about is survival budgeting. Let's go through that for me.
You mentioned how the cash system may be good for different people and it may be good at different times of their lives. I definitely find that is the case, especially with the survival budget. The survival budget, the idea is that you identify just the very most essential expenses in your life. Typically, it's just rent, the basics for food, and maybe transportation to work. Like those are usually the most essential, like just for purely survival. And then you basically cut out everything else. I mean, this is like an extreme budget, and you would never want to do this on a extended basis. However, the survival budget is actually really, really effective if you need to save, maximize your savings over a short period of time. So I've actually used, maybe not the most extreme version of this budget, but a version of this when I was trying to close on a house sale and I needed as much cash as possible in the bank. And so for 3 months, my wife and I, we just ate ramen. We didn't go out anywhere. We didn't do anything. And it's tough. It is very tough, but it's a useful thing to have kind of in your repertoire and go to when you need it.
Yes, I agree. So I'm not a big fan of living on a survival budget for, more than you have to, right? It's bare bones. It's when you go to work and the company has closed doors with locks on it. They don't exist anymore. And you're like, okay, I don't have a job. We got to go to survival mode. So that's the key word there, is survival mode. Here is what I have learned, because my wife and I, we went on a survival budget when we went completely broke. And so we did this for, we were rice and beans, no cable. We sold furniture, sold everything off, the pictures off the wall, sold our cars, never had fun, never went to a coffee shop. We cut our life back like to extreme levels. And we did that because we had a goal in mind of paying off our debt. Now, we had got so used to living on a survival budget, Jeff, that once we paid off our debt, we didn't know how to go back to normal. And it was not healthy. Inside our course, Awesome Money course, when students get to that point where they pay off all their credit card debt or pay off that car, that student loan, one of the things we tell them is okay, go celebrate, right? You have cash now. You don't have debt. Go out and celebrate, go out and do those things. So one thing I caution people about survival budget is make sure you put in red letters at the top of your budget. It is temporary. This is not a permanent thing. You will burn yourself out. This is not sustainable. We're moving from point A to point B. When we get to point B, survival budget's gone. Alrighty, Jeff, let's go on to the balanced money formula.
Yeah, so this is another really popular one. And the reason for its popularity has to do with the fact that it prescribes to you guideline for how much you should be spending and saving. So when you create your own budget, you sort of have to define yourself, okay, this is how much I'm going to put towards coffee for the month, or whatever category you're going to do if you do zero-based budgeting. A common question that comes up for people who are doing it the first time is, how much should I be saving in the first place? how much of my income should I allocate to different things? And so the idea behind the balanced money formula is that it's a general guideline that works for most people. And so they split things down into 3 categories: needs, wants, and then savings, where they say kind of at this rough estimate that 50% of your income should go to needs. So those are the things, your normal monthly bills and kind of major important expenses that you have each month. 20% going to savings. So like just don't even think about it. Just 20% put into savings. And then the other 30%, that's kind of your free spend that you can put for any arbitrary spending. Now, this works well for some people who just need some sort of guideline and they feel that it kind of works. But obviously, because it's these kind of static amounts, it doesn't work for everybody. So I found that it is this 80-20 rule, that there's kind of like the general people with average income level in the United States and that type of thing, where this generally works out over everyone. But certainly, depending on your situation, this doesn't make any sense. So I've seen different variations of it where they adjust the amounts to keep it simple. But the idea at the high level is keeping it simple: 3 categories, fixed amounts, and just do those 3 things, hit those numbers each month, and then you don't have to worry about other levels of categorization.
I've heard the same thing you said before, the 50, 30, 20. I was just recently attending a church service, and they were talking about the 40, 30, 20, 10, which is basically the same thing you said, but the 10% would be in the tithing. Savings is 20. They lower the expenses that go out to 30, I believe. Yeah, 40, 30, 20, 10. So I think there's lots of different strategies there. Here's the problem I see with that, and tell me if you agree here, is how can you apply let's just use your example, a 50, 30, 20 example to a person living in San Francisco to a person living somewhere, like say Southern Indiana. And the biggest difference there is cost of living is completely different. And I think another thing it does too is, let's say you're living in Southern Indiana and the cost of living is a lot different than say in San Francisco. You have the ability to save more, but the formula says only save this much. So I think it's too restrictive in that sense, that it doesn't give you enough flexibility. Like you said, there's a lot of different variations there. But one thing that I remember, we were talking about doing this inside our program, and I remember somebody said, this doesn't work for me. I live outside the Bay Area, and that's not how spending works here. And I'm like, you're right. It's different. I think it's a good method to get started with, just like anything. But depending on where you live, what you do for a living, your income, so many different factors there that I think you're not going to like it long term. You might, but you may not. The fourth one we have here is the budget burndown. Let's go through that one.
Yeah, so this one has some elements of all 3 others in some degree included. At a high level, though, the idea behind budget burndown is to make budgeting simple. So if you imagine the most important parts of budgeting, you can kind of break it down into a formula, which includes income, to start off with, what you're making, minus bills, like what are your reoccurring bills, and then minus whatever you're spending throughout that month. And when you calculate those just 3 simple values, the remaining amount is what in budget burndown called free to spend. And so the free to spend amount is your complete one bucket of money that you have to spend on any arbitrary expense that you have throughout the month, outside of the bills that you've already accounted for. And so this is different than zero-based budgeting because you're not upfront allocating things to different categories. You're just saying that, okay, you just have this one bulk amount that you have to spend. The trick and the reason why this works is because an important part of budget burndown is that you have to have this online in-sync real-time monitor for your free to spend. It's important that your expenses on a daily basis link up to whatever you're using to monitor that free to spend amount, because the concept as a whole is similar to the gas gauge on your car, where when you're driving, almost no one these days runs out of gas. I know people do. I've done it once before in my life, but relatively speaking, people don't run out of gas. And that's because they have this very simple monitor in front of them all the time, telling them how close they are to empty. And when they get close, they make certain adjustments to make sure that they have enough fuel. And in a similar way, the free to spend gauge will show how much of your monthly total amount that you have left to spend. And naturally, this is something that typically you need some sort of automated system in order to do budget burn down. And the people that do use this, it becomes kind of ingrained in their head as the free to spend amount gets lower, they naturally restrict their spending because they don't want to get to empty.
So I love the budget burn down method as well. So we have something similar to it. I like your style better, but we look at, for just about everybody out there, Jeff, there are a handful of expenses that don't change, right? Your mortgage and rent is going to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
If you put stuff on the equalizer plan, like our utilities for our house here in Arizona, it is the exact same every month because we put it what's called the equalizer plan. We're a big fan of that. Your phone bill, for the most part, your internet, your cable, your insurance, your medications, all of those things are the same. One of the things I tell people about budgeting is you have to go through every single expense in your life. And I'm like, just once, because they're the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have that kind of freedom afterwards. And you don't hear this often. I just use the word freedom when we're talking about formulating a plan for our cash flow, is you have the kind of the freedom afterwards that, okay, now that those things are accounted for, now we get to kind of work backwards. And I mean, tell me if I'm on the right track on this one. Budget burn down is almost like reverse budgeting.
Yeah, in a way it is. I would agree with that.
You're basically, okay, we've already spent everything, not technically spent it, but it's been accounted for. And now you're just going through and you're saying, okay, here's how much we have left for each and every month, correct? Or each and every day, actually.
The philosophy is that if you are on track, it shouldn't waste your time necessarily categorize everything and spend. I mean, that's where it's useful. No doubt it's useful. But really, if you are hitting your savings goals, does it matter? We use Budget Burn Down for the app that I work on, Swish. And we're very sensitive to money has a link to happiness. And spending money, not always, but spending money, there are things that make people happy. And you should embrace that. It's not about just cutting every expense all the time and maximizing. I mean, we're not trying to live through a survival budget throughout our life all the time. There's a balance that's needed between enjoying life, going out and doing things and hitting our goals. So you should embrace that if you hit your goal, if you set your goal and you hit it, don't worry too much about what you're spending on. Now, it's a different story if you don't hit your goal. And so typically with budget burn down, there's this, like you were talking about, it's kind of reverse budgeting. And a lot of that comes into effect. If you miss your goal, you can look back and see what you spent your money on because it needs to be a system that's kind of like your transactions are hooked into the monitor. So you can look back to see what you spend your money on. And then you can kind of retroactively look and know that you spend okay, for this month, we went to Starbucks every day and I can't do that. So next month, I'm not going to do that. So then you can adjust your behavior that way moving forward.
Okay, so you have mentioned you have an app. I want to talk about this app a little bit. I'll kind of give you the history here for our listeners is running the Money Peach blog and podcast. We get asked quite a bit about, hey, I have a new app. I'd love to come on the show and share the app with your audience. And we always say, no, we have to test it first. And if we like it, and we have to love it, actually. If we love it, then we'll talk about having you on the show. Not because we're snobby or anything like that. It's just because I can't have 24 different apps doing the same thing every other episode. That's not what the show is about. So we're very selective. When we first started talking about some business stuff, you started off with a site called Get Human. Kind of just give me a 1-minute overview or less of what is Get Human.
Yeah, it's funny because it won't be immediately obvious how Get Human is related to a budgeting app. But then after I think I go through it, it will make a lot more sense. So Get Human is a website that's been around for a long time, since 2006, when the founder of kayak.com, Paul English, created this side project called Get Human that had all of the cheat codes through the phone trees for every major company. It basically was a way that you get people to avoid having to wait on hold for trying to reach a customer service agent to get your customer service problem solved. And almost immediately, it became really popular. And Paul was doing it just as a side project. But after 6 months or something into it, he had millions of people going to use this site. And he was at a venture-backed startup in kayak, so he couldn't really focus too much energy on it and kind of put it to the side. But in 2012, myself and Christian Allen, who was working for Paul at that time, we sort of took it over and created a business out of it to help people with customer service problems. And the part where kind of budgeting starts to come in is that we, at one point, decided that we wanted to go beyond just kind of giving people information and tools to contact companies. And we just wanted to help them solve these problems that they had. So we created a virtual assistant kind of concierge service where people would pay us, $20 or $30, depending on what the problem was. And they would just tell us what the problem is. And then we would call the company and we would deal with their issues. And after about a year and a half of doing that, there were some ups and downs, but overall, the business wasn't viable. We were losing money on a per unit basis because it's hard to solve customer service problems. It requires a lot of time and effort, and we just couldn't do everything for everyone. But we noticed that the things that we did really well were usually financially related. They were usually either somebody needed to negotiate their bill, like they wanted a lower Comcast bill, or they overpaid for something, or like they needed a refund on a non-refundable flight, something like that. And so anything where there was money related or financial related, we were able to negotiate for them, get them back a really good return, and everybody was happy. And that was like the one segment out of that whole business that actually worked really well. So we said, okay, like if we're going to focus on finances, we should take our learnings from here and actually talk to these users and isolate the people who got those experiences and talk about what they need. And what we found with a lot of people, the people that were paying us to do these things, this was part of a larger thing that they were trying to gain control over their finances. Like just like I'm sure a lot of people listening and yourself, Chris, know that this is a major problem within the US and around the world, that people not necessarily feeling in control, like feeling that, companies are trying to get the best of them, that they're overpaying on stuff, that they're not hitting their savings goals. And so it's during the conversations with these people and trying to understand what the root problems were that we realized that we needed to create something to service that. So that's where we started to create this budgeting app as the tool to kind of service this major need that we ran into.
The reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about Get Human is you're one of the first people that's come to me that said, hey, we have this app. We'd like you to test it out as far as, your background in personal finance. And the history you guys have of developing software, developing apps, right away I kind of felt like, okay, this is not going to be like, there's not going to be a lot of glitches. And I see a lot of that. And so one thing I've been using, it's called Swish app. We're going to have links in our show notes to it. I've been using it for a little over, I'd say 5 weeks. We probably had this first conversation. And it's really cool. It's really simple. And it uses that budget burn down process we talked about, the fourth type of budget. We'll put some screenshots and stuff on the show notes of this. But one thing I really like is it's safe. And we talk about that. What do you guys use as far as, so I know we connect to, you connect to your banks and connect to your credit card or institutions. What are you guys using for that safety?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because, now that we're really into iterating on the product and talking to our users who are using Swish today, it's very clear that one of the biggest hurdles people have, starting with not only Swish, this is just for any kind of budgeting app out there, is sort of a trust factor and sort of understanding the security level of involved to protect their financial information. There's sort of a couple levels of that, but at a high level, we use a trusted service provider called Plaid that is very well known in the industry, and they facilitate basically communications with every financial institution. So we actually don't do that directly. Like they are FDIC insured. They are very, like, security is their kind of like number one thing. And the way it works is that they will basically get a token from the financial institution that allows us to have read-only access. We have no ability to change anything whatsoever. We only have the ability with this token that they give us to read the transactions that come into your accounts. And then we use that. And the transactions just have a description and the amount, basically. And then we use that to basically roll it into your budget and figure out how much you have left to spend for the month.
Gotcha. So those of you listening to the show for a while, just about every single person we've had on the show that's had some kind of app, whether it's a debt payoff tool or an investing tool, or even something like this, a budget burn down tool, everybody's using Plaid. It's I would say it's the most common in the industry as far as encryption and keeping your stuff safe. And the nice thing is Jeff and his company, they're not worrying about storing your passwords or anything like that. They don't have access to that. That's all done over at Plaid. So they're just controlling the app. They don't have any kind of like sensitive information of yours, which I don't think they want, to be honest with you. I don't think they want that at all.
That's a true statement, yes.
For those of us who are thinking about, okay, you know what, I like the idea of trying this Swish out. Kind of tell me the process of, we're going to have a link in the show notes of where you can go grab it. But the app is offered Apple, and is it on Android?
Yes.
Okay, so we can get it in both places. What's the process? What is step 1, step 2, and so on as far as onboarding with Swish? What does that look like?
Yeah, so for the onboarding process, there's essentially just 4 steps because we do need to link to your bank account in order to get transactions. That's how it works, because on a continuous basis, as you're spending, you are constantly updating all of your free to spend, the amount of money you have left to spend in the month. So you link your bank accounts, then you enter in your income, identify your bills, like what are your monthly bills that occur every single month. And then the last thing is identifying, your savings goals. Like what are you trying to save for? And like how much out of your budget do you want to allocate to the saving? And then based off of that, we calculate essentially your budget. Like what's the total bucket of money that you have to spend for the entire month? And then throughout the month, the free to spend monitor burns down. It shows you every day how much money you have left to spend for the month, and then for that day. Like, okay, for today, you should, if you want to stay on track, only spend $75 or whatever it happens to be.
One of the things I really like about this, and you and I have talked about this in the past, is one of the things I cannot stand about some of the apps out there, it drives me nuts, is let's say, for example, that I get a bunch of cash. I go out to dinner and I spend cash for dinner, for the whole dinner, and then a couple friends Venmo me some money, right?
Yeah.
And so it drives me nuts because then it looks like I spent when I really didn't spend because there was some cash handed to me in Venmo or whatever. This is my favorite part. I like how I can go in and I can go into the transaction. I can say, don't count it. It's just, that's what I love. I mean, that's like when I first saw that, I'll be honest with you, Jeff, I was getting ready to use it and then be like, hey, I don't like this. But right away I saw like, oh, the don't count app. And that's exactly what happened. We went out to dinner. I want to say somebody paid for it all and then we all just Venmoed them or something like that. And then it showed up on there and I'm like, no, I don't want it to be there. Oh, don't count. Click on that and then it goes away. Why hasn't anyone thought of this before? Like this is revolutionary and it's so simple. I've never seen it. So that's when I called you up and I'm like, hey, I actually really like this. When can we have you on the show? It was that button.
You bring up one other thing that you will be interested to hear that we just added along the lines of the exact scenario you brought up. In other cases, when you're splitting something with other people, you actually did spend money from your own account, but you know that other people are kind of paying you back. And in terms of like accounting for that for your Burndown, you essentially need to, like the transaction comes in as like, let's say it was $150. You kind of paid for it up front and everybody else gave you cash. It shows up as $150, but it really wasn't. You really spent only like $20, let's say. And so this is actually something that a lot of our users started to tell us was happening. So we just added this past week, in fact, a split feature so that you can, when that happens, you just hit split and just identify what the split is, and then it adjusts the free to spend accordingly.
So it's the guy that actually listens to his audience with some feedback and then makes the implementations. Oh my gosh, who's actually doing this these days? This is amazing. All right, Jeff, we are getting ready to wrap up here. I have a couple questions I ask everybody on the show, and you know they're coming because you listened to the show before. But the first question I'm going to ask you is, if you could read one book forever or give one book away or recommend one book, it could be anything, doesn't have to be money book, what would you recommend and why?
Well, I'm going to go a little bit of a classic on you because I feel like in like the self-helpish type or business type book area, a lot of material gets recycled. So the classics, are really, they still ring true like throughout, today and in a lot of other material that gets put out there. So I've always loved The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. It's something that I read when I was a lot younger. It just really hit me back then, and I go back and I reread it all the time. It's just something that I just love, and I hope that everybody out there does read it. It's definitely a classic.
It is a classic. I think that book should be forced to be read your senior year in high school because it could have such a game changer in the road that you go down starting at age 18. So the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, Stephen Covey. The number one habit is the one I always talk about. It's the number one habit is be proactive. So be proactive and click on the link that buys the book called 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. It will change your life. All right. I love that. Okay. The second question I have for you, Jeff, is on your phone. What's your home screen? What's a picture of?
It's my kids. Isn't it for anyone who has children? I mean, maybe not, but I always imagine that it would be. But I change it out every couple months for something funny some funny picture of them. Usually I try to do it as a picture that made me laugh at the time. So whenever I open up my phone, it sort of brings me joy because I see this very funny situation of some weird thing that they were doing.
I love it. And I have 2 kids and they are not on my home screen. And it's funny you just said that because the other day my son goes, Hey, Dad, how come you have a picture of mommy on the screen and not me? And I was like, it's simple. I loved her first. And that for like a 7-year-old, that makes perfect sense. He's like, oh, that makes sense. So Jeff, lastly, where can we find out more about Swish, more about you? Where should we head on over to?
So the best thing for Swish is to go to swish.com and you can learn all about it. I also have a course on Udemy. If you go to udemy/master-my-money. Also, there is a YouTube channel. I'm the host of my own kind of podcast on YouTube Live called Swish Money Live. And then the last thing is if you want to follow me on Twitter. I talk about this stuff all the time on Twitter. It's just at Jeff Whelpley, as well as other tech stuff if you're into that.
Alrighty. Hey, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm excited for you guys developing Swish to even something better than it is right now because you guys are always constantly working at it, which I love. And we'll try to get you back on the show maybe down the road to talk more about budgeting because, hey, as we just broke down, budgeting is not boring. It's not bread and water in prison and all that yucky stuff. It's fun, it's cool, and it could change your life. So, Jeff, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Chris.
And just like that, we wrap up another amazing episode of the Money Peach podcast. All the show notes, the links, anything Jeff and I talked about can be found over at moneypeach.com/session90. That's moneypeach.com/session90. Special thanks goes out to my producer, Steve Stewart, and my assistant, Kayla Sloan. Without them, this show would not be possible. Stay tuned next week for episode 91, where I bring on the founder of InvestorJunkie.com, Larry Ludwig. We're going to dive into the world of robo-advisors, micro-investing, real estate investing in the passive sense, and what you should be doing with your money, where to invest, and what are some of the risks going on right now in the world of robo-advising.
The biggest issue that people have is not knowing where to begin. Starting with the basics, starting with the whole idea of compound interest and really understanding the earlier you start this stuff, the more likely you're better off it would be. Money grows on top of itself.
See you guys next week, same time, same place, for another amazing episode of the Money Peach podcast. Thanks for listening.
Boom, da-ba-doom, boom, da-ba-doom.